So we have yet another edition of Americans realizing just how weird the USA actually is after living abroad. Now, I've been living abroad for the better part of the past 2 years across Europe and Asia, and out of all the countries I've visited thus far and lived in, no country has shocked me as much as the USA. Returning to the USA earlier this year for 3 months provided me with the deepest sense of culture shock that I have ever experienced and maybe ever will experience. And if you don't believe me, believe them. Without further ado, let's get into this first video.
Racking up, I asked this person to elaborate on what she meant by Americans having bad manners, especially when guests are over.
So first of all, let's read this comment. What shocked me the most when I moved from Germany to the US is the lack of manners at the table and how guests act when they're over. So that's an interesting one.
And she listed a bunch of stuff, and one of the first things she said was lip smacking. Like when they're eating and chewing their food, they smack their lips so loud, and I had to cringe to myself because it is actually such an American thing.
So I'm not gonna lie. I know people who do this. I know people who smack their lips when they eat. And I used to be one of those people, actually. I used to be someone who smacked my lips when I ate. Most people who do it don't even know that they're doing it because they haven't been told otherwise. And it wasn't until, I think it was snack time in school, around 4th grade, so around 9 or 10 years old, that this girl kept complaining to the teacher that I was smacking. And I was like, what do you mean? What is smacking? I couldn't understand it. I was actually getting mad at her for telling the teacher on me. But once I identified what smacking was, my life was never the same again, because there are people in my household that I grew up in who smack very, very loudly. And it became one of my biggest pet peeves. And come to think of it, I don't think I ever encountered that in Europe. I don't know if I've encountered that here in Asia thus far. I know that in some cultures in Asia, it is more normalized to do that. I know just being here in Vietnam, noise in general is a lot more normal. So I can imagine that something like smacking would kind of blend into the background, so to speak. But my goodness, smacking is something that I personally just find borderline intolerable. I would never ever live in a country where smacking is the norm rather than the exception. And as far as table manners go in general, something else that I noticed is that my girlfriend and her family seem to be very good at using a knife and fork. That's something that I never learned how to do. I think because growing up, I kind of just used to eat with my hands, to be honest. I think until around 12 or 13, I mostly just ate with my hands. And once I learned how to use a fork and knife, well, I never really learned how to use a knife. I kind of just would use my fork to cut things. But I don't think that's that big of an issue. I don't really see that as being bad manners per se. But the smacking, trauma.
I've noticed it so much in American households. People just like chew so loudly and eat so loudly. I'm not saying other cultures or people around the world don't do that, and it's definitely not every American, but I have noticed that people do that here, and I think it's kind of gross.
The thing is, I don't even think it's gross per se. It's just the sound of it sends chills up my spine. And it's just, I just can't do it. I'm so glad that my girlfriend does not do that. I'm so glad that she doesn't do that.
Another thing she said was using paper plates in your home. Like even when you have dishes available to use, Americans will still use paper plates and like plastic cups and plastic cutlery. I just think it's so wasteful.
So that's an interesting one because I never really came across that. I never came across a household where using paper and plastic cutlery was the norm. I think I mostly see that at family reunions and things like that, large gatherings where people just aren't trying to wash all of those dishes. But even during the holidays, if I recall correctly, we always just used regular dishes. So maybe that's on a household by household basis. But I will say that the plastic usage overall in the US and especially here in Asia is much more egregious than I ever saw in Europe.
But it is, yeah, a typical American thing. Okay, and then another one I wanted to add to this because I actually saw people having a conversation/argument about this on TikTok somewhere a while ago. but about how Americans don't take off their shoes when they go inside of their home or other people's homes. Europeans cringe.
So that's an interesting one. Again, I think that's on a household by household basis, because in the European homes that I was in, it was actually the norm to keep your shoes on. And I think pretty much all of them had house shoes. I think I had house shoes as well. But even just wearing your outside shoes, it was completely normal. So I don't know if that's just a Dutch thing. I think I actually reacted to a video about that fairly recently. But let me know in the comments if that's normal where you're from. Especially if you're from the Netherlands, do you wear your shoes in the house? I think also this might correlate with having hardwood floors compared to carpet, because I think it's kind of universally regarded as strange to wear your shoes on the carpet, whereas wearing shoes on hardwood isn't that bad because hardwood's easier to clean. But I don't know, I'm just throwing ideas out there because I don't really know why some cultures see it as such a bad thing and some just don't care at all. Growing up, for the most part, we took our shoes off up until about a certain point. I think once I kind of hit my teenage years, my mom just stopped caring and I would just wear my shoes in the house. But again, I would take them off on the carpet.
At that, because in Europe and in most other places around the world, you take off your shoes before you go into someone's home. Like, that's just a sign of respect, right? In America, people don't take off their shoes because they think it's more rude to bring in their stinky feet, like if their feet smell, into someone's house. I don't know how you guys feel about.
No, you gotta wash your feet. If that's an issue, if you can't take your shoes off, wash your feet. Definitely don't bring that into my house. Don't bring that into my apartment.
About that, I always take off my shoes when I go indoors because I just think it's more hygienic. But yeah, Europeans would always make comments about how in American TV shows and movies, they always saw Americans wearing their shoes like in the bedroom and even on the beds. And I do think it's so disgusting, but I really don't see any other culture doing that. Like, why is that such an American thing to wear your shoes in the house? I don't know.
So I never thought about that, but she raised a really good point about how in American TV shows, which of course most Americans grew up watching American TV shows, it's generally the norm that the characters have their shoes on inside of the house. So it follows that culturally, Americans would see that as a normal thing. My mom watched a lot of Filipino soap operas as I was growing up, but I never paid attention to if the characters had their shoes on indoors. But I know that in most Asian cultures, pretty much all Asian cultures that I'm aware of, it is completely abnormal to ever wear your shoes inside of the house. So again, I'm very curious to hear what the norm is where you're from. On to the next video. POV, you live in America and the houses are suddenly made out of paper. You know what? I don't think I've ever seen a house that had wooden walls before. I've never seen that. He must live in an old house, an old house. That's very, very funny though, because I never realized how low quality American carpentry work is. No offense if you're an American carpenter, but I never realized how low quality the work was until I went to Europe. Because I want to say that my girlfriend and I were talking on the phone one time. This is when we were still long distance. So she was in the Netherlands, I was in the US. And I think I casually mentioned something about punching a hole in the wall. Not that I had actually done that, but I just remember it kind of came up in conversation. And she was confused by it. And I didn't understand why she was so confused by it. She probably thought, to punch a hole in the wall, you have to be Hercules or something like that. But in the US, really any grown adult, male or female probably, could put a hole in the wall fairly easily with their bare hands. Or if they kick the wall, they could put a hole in the wall. In Europe, that is not the case. And I found that out very quickly when I went to my girlfriend's family house, when I knocked on the wall and it sounded completely solid. Now, I don't know what's inside of those walls, but there is something in there. There's something in there, or the walls are just thicker or something, because in the US, it's usually just hollow. And I've seen a lot of houses in the US as they were being built, because the neighborhood that I grew up in was not complete whenever we moved there. So I was in and out of a lot of those houses as they were finishing them. And basically what they do is they put up a wood frame And after they put up the wood frame, they put the little cotton looking stuff. I guess it's insulation. I don't really know. I'm not a carpenter, but that pink stuff, that pink cotton type stuff, they put that up on the walls, and then they put up the, I guess, drywall, whatever it's called. They put up the wall material, and that's it. And that's why it has that hollow sound like this. That's why it sounds like that, is because that's all there is in there. But that notion of just punching a hole in the wall, that does not exist in Europe. You will break your hand. If you punch a hole, or you try to punch a hole in the wall in Europe, at least in the Netherlands, I don't know about other European countries, but in the Netherlands, you are going to the hospital. Thankfully, you have better health care. Different discussion for a different day. On to the next video. Reverse culture shocks when I go back to the US from Germany.
As an American who's lived in Germany for over 5 years, there's a lot of things that take some getting used to each time I go back home.
Americans make it impossible to forget what country you're in. And unless it's the Olympics or World Cup, I've never seen this many flags in Germany.
So I mean, Germany is probably the perfect example of a country that is as non-nationalistic as possible. I could be completely wrong about that, by the way, because I've never been there, but I would just assume that based on historical events, putting up a bunch of flags everywhere would not be seen as socially acceptable. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments on that, but that would be the rationale that I would assume to be the case. Here in Vietnam, I've actually found it to be the case that there are many more Vietnamese flags than I ever saw American flags in the US, which that's been a very big culture shock, because even in Thailand, I didn't see nearly as many Thai flags as I've seen Vietnamese flags in Vietnam. So definitely seems to be more of a nationalistic vibe here. But as far as American flags being all over the place, I know for sure you'll see them in every classroom, because you have to say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning, which is really, really weird, by the way, that you make 8-year-olds pledge allegiance to a country and they can't even name 10 states in the country. But I digress. But you will see a lot of flags, and in Texas, where I grew up, you'll probably see just as many Texas flags, if not more Texas flags, than American flags as you go about your day-to-day life.
Thought I'd never adjust, but I'm so used to not having air conditioning in Berlin. And since my family lives in Florida, the AC is on year round, in the house, in the car, in every building we go to. And those buildings are big. I forgot what
So as far as the AC thing, I'm not gonna lie, old habits die hard. And what I mean by that is that's the one American habit that I have taken with me wherever I've gone, at least throughout Asia, because Asia is hot. All right, Vietnam, Thailand, it's hot out here.
it's like to have so many options to choose from in the grocery store. And now I quickly get overwhelmed. I've certainly gotten used to minding my own business in Germany. So anytime a stranger smiles...
So as far as having all of the options, I've already beaten this topic to death, but in case you haven't seen any of those other videos, I've always found it really odd, especially as I've gone about building my own business. And of course, my business doesn't compare to Walmart or Target when we talk about profits. It's not even close. But the way I approach business is I like to think in terms of efficiency. So for example, if I have a video idea that performs better than my other video ideas, I'm going to do more of that. I'm going to do more of the thing that's working at the expense of the things that are not working, because I want to receive the most in return for my effort. That's the whole idea of leverage. And as a business owner, I see it as my obligation to do that. It seems like these big box grocery stores in particular operate with the exact opposite mentality, where when something's working, let's say, for example, these Ruffles right here, okay, this is probably the best-selling thing, or maybe these Cheeto Puffs, these are probably two of the best-selling chips right here. Instead of just expanding that and having more of that, or just having this section and making the store smaller overall. This isn't the best example because Costco and Sam's, she's in one of those two stores, I assume, they're basically wholesale direct to consumer. So it's kind of a whole different strategy. But in Walmart, for example, it doesn't really make sense to have 30 different flavors of these Cheeto Puffs when most people are just going to get the original flavor. It just seems like a waste of space. Now, from what I understand, from what I've read in some of my comments, apparently that is a psychological marketing tactic where I think they want to elicit decision fatigue, which encourages you to purchase more. I don't remember the exact logistics of how it works. I think I also touched on that in another video, but in my head, and really not just in my head, but in my day-to-day life in the Netherlands, I really enjoyed having those smaller stores because they're easier to navigate and they tend to have the things that I actually want to buy. So it's not just a bunch of empty space or a bunch of inventory that I will never even consider buying. They just have mostly stuff that I'm actually interested in. And I'm sure that it works out well for them because their stores are smaller, therefore their overhead is smaller. But I don't know. That's just how I view business.
Minding my own business in Germany. So anytime a stranger smiles, compliments me, or asks me a question in the States, I'm very thrown off.
What other reverse culture shocks have you heard of?
So as far as people just starting up random conversations with you, that's something that I had to adjust to as well whenever I visited the US earlier this year. In fact, before we even got to the US, I think we flew from Amsterdam to London Heathrow and then from Heathrow to Dallas. In Heathrow, as we were boarding the plane, obviously I was kind of around a lot of American people because I don't think a whole lot of British people are trying to go to Dallas. So it was mostly Americans coming back from London. And I was talking to my girlfriend about the movies on the plane. I was saying, wow, I really hope they have Interstellar on the plane because Interstellar, that's my favorite movie. All right, if you know, you know. Great, great movie. But I was saying, I hope they have Interstellar on the plane, which they didn't. But the guy behind me was like, yeah, Interstellar is a great movie. And initially, because I had been in the Netherlands for 14 months, instead of assuming he was speaking to me, I just assumed that it was a coincidence that we were both talking about Interstellar at the same time. And so I turned around. I did the little half turnaround thing where you're not really sure if someone's talking to you or if they're talking to someone else. And sure enough, he was talking to me. And the fact that he felt so comfortable interjecting himself into our conversation, it's not to say that I saw it as a negative thing per se, but it definitely took some getting used to. And I will say that being here in Vietnam, where people tend to be a lot more to themselves, where you can be in an elevator and no one says anything to you, that is something that I really, really appreciate, especially given how big of an introvert I am.